some significant news broke yesterday with regard to Columbia University. Let's put this up on the screen. So they announced their decision yesterday to cancel their university-wide commencement amid protests, this headline says, and they cite specifically some vague, quote-unquote, security threat. Noteworthy that previously the justification for like bringing in the cops and clearing out the encampment and all that was, hey, we gotta get it together so we can host a commencement. You can put this up on the screen. This is part of the statement from the president of Columbia. It's gonna take time to heal, but I know we can do that. I hope we can use the weeks ahead to restore calm, allow students to complete their academic work and honor their achievements at commencement. But apparently, I mean, listen, I don't think anyone should take their like security threat thing here seriously. They're worried about it being disruptive. Yes. They're worried about a show of, you know, how widely supported these protests are, not only among the students, but among the faculty. They're panicked about, you know, the donor class meltdown that they've already seen. And so like UCLA before them, they decided better just to cancel it altogether so no one can see any potential exercises of free speech. Because, Saagar, we covered yesterday, there have been graduation ceremonies that have had protests. It hasn't been a big deal. You know, some people stand up with flags, they, you know, get cheered or booed or whatever, they're escorted out, and that's the end of the story, and everybody continues with their day. So, you know, there's, I guess, two things to say. Number one, like I said, it's not about security, it's about they don't want to be embarrassed and they don't want to be out of control. And number two, you know, this has everything to do with the manufactured panic that has been created, and they just want it to end and be able to, you know, silence everyone and move forward.
It is about the donors and the parents who would be coming there more than it is about anything else, obviously. As evidenced, like you said, at previous ones. There were annoying protesters, by the way, at my graduation, if I recall. I think it was at the height of Ferguson.
It's very common to have protests.
No, it is very common,
we did at mine, but I can barely even remember because it wasn't even like that big a deal, you know?
I'm with you. I agree with you. I mean, I don't particularly care. I remember, but at the same time, if I recall, the university was like, there will be no political signs on people's hats, and then people did it anyway because they're like, what are you gonna do?
Who cares?
Oh, my degree?
Yeah.
And then some people's parents were outraged and other parents were supporting. I guess this is a time-honored tradition. Let's put the next one, please, up there on the screen. This kind of gets to some of what we previewed yesterday about what we were going to talk about. There's been some interesting new polling now about how Americans feel about these quote pro-Palestinian college protests. So I'll go through support and oppose. The top line, US adults, is 28% strongly or somewhat support. Not sure, 24. Strongly or somewhat opposed is 47%, so definitely plurality. Now, there is an age gap, 18 to 44, 40% strongly or somewhat support, 31% not sure, 30% strongly or somewhat opposed. 45 and older, basically completely flipped. You got 62% who completely oppose, 19% only who support, 19%.
Pretty wild age gap.
What do I tell you about boomers, folks?
Yeah, it's pretty wild age gap.
Non-college graduates, this is another important one. Important to me because it's the support figure and the don't know figure, which are really interesting, where the oppose is relatively similar. So you got 38% college grads who support, 15% not sure, 48% opposed. Non-college is 24% support, 29% just not sure, as in probably just don't care, and then 47% who oppose. Amongst Democrats, you got 46% Democrats who support, independents 24, Republicans 16, and then on the opposition, you got 31% Democrats, 44% independents, 69% Republicans. Not a surprise. They've got a breakdown there by religion, but do you want to comment on this before we go through more of them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I actually, to be honest with you, this, you know, as someone who does support the protests, given what I know about historic disapproval of protests and given what I've seen in terms of the overwhelming media and political class manufacturing of consent around these protests, I'm actually surprised the numbers aren't worse. Like the fact that you still have 18 to 44-year-olds, plurality of whom are in favor. The fact that the Democratic number, I mean, Joe Biden is really going against his own base, because there's a very clear plurality, 46% of Democrats who are in support specifically of the college campus protests and only 31% who oppose. You know, the religion gap is also quite extraordinary and quite notable. But to be honest with you, these numbers are not as bad as I frankly feared that they would be.
Interesting. Cope in my opinion, a little bit, because there's still a 47% opposed figure there in terms of the plurality of the public is against it.
Yeah, but if you look at like Vietnam War protests, which we have these numbers we can get to in a minute.
Let's get to that.
They were way more negative than this. So.
Well, no. We'll get to that. Let's go to the next part. This is about too harsh or not harsh enough. This, again, is where I would say there's some warning signs. Amongst U.S. adults, 33%, the plurality here, at least in this one, are saying that it has not been harsh enough of a response. 31% not sure, about right 20, 16% say too harsh. 18 to 44, you've actually got a plurality who are saying it's about right or not sure. 22% say too harsh, 16% not harsh enough. But again, look at that older figure, 45% and older, 45 and older, 48% are saying not harsh enough.
Yeah,
and 12%
they love their order.
Harsh. College graduates, actually very similar. There's definitely more who will say too harsh, but there's still a plurality amongst college grads for the not harsh enough figure. Same for the non-college graduates figure, although the number is higher amongst not sure. Amongst Democrats even, the about right figure is the one that really takes the cake at 30%. So even amongst people who necessarily support the protests are saying it is about right for the police response. Republicans and independents, independents actually relatively split. Republicans obviously saying it's not been harsh enough. And then a similar breakdown there amongst religion. Finally, let's go to the next part. This is just on the latest parts. This is about protecting free speech. This can be relatively grim as somebody who definitely supports free speech. Do Americans think colleges should focus more on protecting free speech or stopping hate speech? U.S. adult citizens say both equally, even though stopping hate speech is a fake thing and is not real.
I mean, you can understand how people say it, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, the overall, this is one of the most unifying questions, actually, where you see some divides among, like, older people are more likely to say stop hate speech, whereas most people who are like, yeah, both. Like, I want to protect, hate speech is bad and free speech is good. Let's do both. So, I don't know. Even though from an ideological perspective, obviously, I think protecting free speech is more important, but it doesn't, I can understand why they got these results, I guess I would say.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
If you're a normal person, you're not thinking, well, actually, there's no such thing as hate speech as opposed to free speech. But
yeah, technically, the First Amendment even applies to it. You're like,
which is true.
You're like, let's do both.
All right.
If both's an option, let's do both. Right? Okay, fair enough.
As Krystal teased, though, there definitely is a difference in terms of Vietnam War protests.
Before we get to that,
sure, yeah.
I want to ask you, because I want to ask you what your takeaway or what you think the implications of these polls are.
My implication is that it's either a wash, it will be marginally important, but the reason why I actually don't pay attention to much as I do to, there was a recent column, we didn't cut it unfortunately, that I just read this morning about why this is very different from Vietnam, is that all of the polling that we have says that Israel-Palestine is not #1 or even top 5. And if anything, is a 15 out of 16 issue for the vast majority of people, including for young people. Whereas in Vietnam, Vietnam was top 5. And in many cases was #1 and #2. The truth is that most people either don't care or they're marginally just like kind of interested, and they're like, yeah, whatever, there's chaos. Maybe I support it, maybe I don't. And the real evidence to me was the huge not sure numbers in all of these, because one thing that really comes out in Vietnam, people were damn sure how they felt. They either felt strong or opposed, because people had thought a lot about Vietnam, whereas with this one, I mean, look, I've said this before, if you watch the show every single day, you're in like the top 1% to 2% of news consumers in this whole country. And yeah, you know, we cover the news in the same way. If you go to the front page of the New York Times, Israel, White House, Trump trial and all that stuff, maybe 5-10% of the country, you know, actually checks in every single day, because at that time, 1.9 million Americans had been drafted into the armed forces, 55,000 killed. The level of civic engagement around the issue was just so much higher that I don't really see it making all that much of a difference. Based on the polling, I would say I would probably be on the side, you know, polling just pure like popularity wise of either the about right figure or of the crackdown. That just seems to be the more popular response. I'm not saying I support that. I don't, for free speech purposes, but I'm just telling you, like, for political purposes, that's probably where I would align if I were a politician.
So you think Joe Biden is handling this well?
Unfortunately, he's probably doing his best given the coalition that he has. He's got the suburban ladies. The abortion ladies are coming out to vote for him.
Yeah, he's already got them. That's
the boomers are loving it. The young people mostly don't vote in particular. They're making life miserable for everybody else. It's like, well, you know, most people, we know how that turns out. Most people are going to turn against that, even amongst college protests.
But who are they making life miserable for?
Well,
like, this hasn't impacted your life or my life.
Not yet.
I mean, it's different than.
I'm just waiting to get stuck in traffic.
It is different from like the Black Lives Matter protests. So we've talked about that. So I think your point about the probably more important numbers are how many people this is a critical issue.
Yes.
Right. This is their number one issue. This is their voting issue.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think that's probably a small number, but it only really takes a small number.
Yeah, we'll see.
But, you know, I mean, look at the uncommitted vote in Michigan. There were a few states where the uncommitted vote itself in a Democratic primary was larger than the margin that Joe Biden won against Donald Trump. So, you know, in that way, even if it's only a small percentage, you say, this is my number one issue, you clearly have some part of the young population in particular who were likely Biden voters who were like, no, not doing it. Can't vote for someone who is funding a agenda, just not gonna do it. And that's a problem for him. The reason I disagree about his response goes back to the analysis. It's similar to the analysis of why I thought he made a big mistake in terms of how he handled immigration. Okay, and there's studies, especially of politicians in Europe, that show when they try to move to the right and be like, no, I'm actually an immigration hardliner as well, it demoralizes their base and divides their base, and it cedes ground to that right-wing perspective. So that if people are like, oh, well, even this guy agrees with the right on immigration, so why am I going to go for the watered down version of that? If I want the law and order crackdown, dude, I'm going with Donald Trump all day long. So I think that's number one. Number two is that the thing that has caused the impression of like chaos is not actually the students who are in relatively small numbers on each of these campuses, like setting up tents. It's the crackdown. It's the police response. It's the police coming in, brutalizing these students. In fact, the initial crackdown at Columbia sparked a massive increase in these protests across the country. So I think the response itself has created this impression of chaos that is a problem for Joe Biden with his like moderate suburban voters. Now, in my opinion, those moderate suburban voters are already voting for him. Like they're not going back to Trump. They're voting for him. Many of them very energized by Dobbs, as you're accurately pointing out. This issue is not important to them. They don't really care either way. So I think he has, number one, divided his own base and coalition. We see that in some of the numbers. Number two, further alienated some potentially small, but also potentially determinative number of young people who are like, you just called me a Nazi. Like, no, I'm not voting for you. And there's nothing you can say is going to change my mind at this point. And number three has created exactly the scenes of chaos that can lead to a conservative backlash that is not going to be like, you're the law and order dude. They're going to be like, Trump's the law and order dude. That's who I'm going with.
Counter to what you're saying is BLM, is that if Joe Biden had embraced defund, he 100% would have lost. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Now, he basically tries to distance himself from the protest movement.
He actually he was much more sympathetic rhetorically to BLM than he was here.
You're right, but he did enough of a job of distancing himself from the violence and not all riot is the voice of the unheard and everybody's suddenly MLK Jr. all of a sudden back in 2020, no black squares on Instagram and no anti-racism Ibrahim Kendi. And that was enough for some moderate voters to come along with him.
But let me say though, that contradicts some analysis from you in the past where you've said, and this is true even, you've made this point about Republicans and abortion, for example, or with the Democrats. Like, even though I don't know, did any Democratic politicians, elected members of Congress, did any of them actively say defund the police? Joe Biden certainly didn't. But your point was a salient one, which is like, it doesn't really matter because they're associated with this thing.
Yeah, that's
right. And Joe Biden was associated with that thing. He was, as I said, rhetorically much more sympathetic to the protesters, was very clear about, yes, I condemn the violence, but let's not use that to distract from the core issues and these core concerns, which are legitimate. And, obviously, he became president of the United States.
The point I'm trying to make is that I definitely think he paid a political price. I think, though, that if he had not navigated it in more of the way that he did, which was trying to split the difference like in a kind of establishment-friendly way, I think he would have lost. I think if he'd been more AOC on the topic, let's say, in terms of people are stealing bread because they're hungry, and more like, listen, you know, we got to hear people out, but at the end of the day, I don't condemn violence, he would have lost the election.
So let me make the counterpoint, which is that if you look back at the polls, when Trump really started to have a problem was after, remember the whole Bible photo op and the, I don't remember which federal agency it was. There were peaceful protesters that were like cracked down, the horses came in, it was crazy.
It was crazy.
And there was a huge backlash to that. And the problem, part of the problem for him in terms of his response at the time is there was chaos and it was happening under him. So my point is that Joe Biden, by greenlighting this crackdown, has created the very chaos that, yes, is a problem for him, and that it sort of doesn't really matter what he says about it because the chaos is happening under him. And if his response is to be like, we need a crackdown, and we'll see what he says about college student protesters today, he's giving some big speech on anti-Semitism. Like, if you're looking for if you are, horrified by what you're seeing on college campuses and you want the law and order guy, that's never going to be Joe Biden. That's going to be Donald Trump.
The thing is about the Trump thing, though, is that there were a majority of the public at the time who supported calling in the National Guard in response to the riots. So it is more complicated. And I don't disagree. He owns the chaos because in a lot of ways, he was like police response, but then wouldn't go all out, and he was all over the place in terms of his, and then what he hid in his bunker during the protests. I remember that being a big story as well. And don't forget COVID on top of that either. So you're not wrong. He paid a price for sure. Now, was it all riots? Was it COVID? I mean, it's very difficult to say. I guess just focusing on this, let's turn to Vietnam because this is actually important and instructive. Let's put this up there on the screen. For example, how Americans felt about the campus protests against the Vietnam War. So as you accurately pointed out in your monologue yesterday, a majority of respondents blame the students not just for violence, but specifically in the deaths of the 4 students.
Yeah, we actually have put the next piece up because we have an overall number about approve or disapprove of public protests.
75%.
Which is why I'm like, well, the protest perception now is actually not that bad compared to this.
No, you're not wrong.
The other point I want to make about this, which was noteworthy to me in looking into this, is that, this was taken in November '69. At this point, public sentiment had already really turned against Vietnam. You had a majority, in fact, I have somewhere the actual numbers, but you had a very clear majority who were opposed to it, who said it was a mistake to ever send US soldiers there. And you had, I think it was somewhere in like the 30s who were still supporting it. So even though public sentiment at this point agreed with the protesters, there was this very visceral reaction against the protests themselves, which is, it's just interesting that can be 2 separate questions, that they can support the issue in general, but also be like, no to these protests.
It makes sense to me, though, because what you're saying is actually, unfortunately, was very different in terms of Vietnam context. So even though the majority of the people had supported and said, it was kind of like Iraq, where we're like, well, we never should have gone, but now that we're there, we need peace with honor. And that was Nixon's entire thing. And that's, again, why I think the protests, remember, Nixon is elected in '68 and escalates the war in Vietnam. The number of deaths actually increased. We have the secret bombing of Cambodia. Vietnamization doesn't happen until later on in the Nixon presidency, where US soldiers are still dying by the hundreds every week in Vietnam. It's insane, actually, to go back and to think about. So I kind of think that the protest movement, in terms of the evidence from back in the day, is very strong for the fact that it was immediate backfire. It didn't work in the immediate term or the near term. We didn't really look back, quote unquote, fondly on Vietnam War protesters until the 1990s when Bill Clinton was elected. Actually, this was an important thing in the '92 election when I think H.W. Bush called him a draft-dodging bum or something because he got a college exemption for a Rhodes Scholarship, and he had hair and he smoked weed at the Vietnam protests. And that was the first time it kind of didn't matter that somebody had opposed the Vietnam War. And that was 30 years later after something. So I'm saying the political fallout from those protests basically led to quasi-Republican rule from 1968 with a brief aberration of Jimmy Carter up until 1992. The same thing actually can be said of the civil rights protests. Do we have the sit-in graphic?
We do. That's like I think the last graphic that we have.
So this question, this is an important one too.
This
gets to what I talked about previously. 1961, people are asked about the sit-in protest. Do you think sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes will hurt or help the Negro chance of being integrated in the South? Hurt, 57%. Help, 27%. Now you can look at that two ways. You can say, and I totally disagree with whoever this tweeter is, as the most iconic and effective protest movement. I don't think it was effective actually at all in the moment. And this gets to a point that I was dying to bring up with you, which is about abolition and about how the history of these things actually happen. So in 1861, you have the Southern secessionists, they go out and the radical Republicans come to Lincoln, they're like, we gotta do abolition, man. We gotta do the Emancipation Proclamation. It's time, the rabble-rousers are gone. And Lincoln famously says, I would like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. As in, we have to have the border slave states who stay within the Union. So who was correct in the long run? The practical, political, practitioner, Abraham Lincoln, who understands abolition is incredibly unpopular, that these radical abolitionists, quote unquote, who we view fondly now at the time, but who had maybe 9% approval rating, in 1860, were they correct, to trying to push him to do something that was very unpopular? Or was he correct to basically lie about his position and work within the political system at the time and force abolition and the emancipation through, basically as a war aim, lying to the American people and saying, well, we're doing it to win the Civil War. It has nothing to do actually with black liberation, even though that's a end result. And I think that's a very important question, is like, who is really responsible? I would say Lincoln is the one who's responsible.
Let me ask you this. Yeah. Is your opinion that no protest movement in history has ever mattered or been successful?
No, but
that seems to be what you're laying out here.
But I'm giving people good evidence. So in 1961, the chances of a Civil Rights Act was zero.
But you're creating a binary choice, though. I mean, what you're basically saying is the only thing that matters is these individual great men. None of the social movements, none of the protest movements, the sit-ins, the freedom riders, the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the anti-apartheid protests, none of these things matter at all. All that matters is that you get one dude in there who's going to do the right thing. And I think that is a fundamental misreading of history. I think it's, you have to have a confluence of factors, right? The social movements are critical. Having, like, the labor movement, pressuring FDR, these things are critical for pressuring these people in power to make these steps in history that are important. So I just can't go along with the idea that protest never works. It always backfires. It's always foolhardy, because when I look at the lunch counter sit-in numbers, like, the conclusion is the exact opposite. It's not only did people disapprove, they found it disorderly, chaotic, et cetera, just like the reaction, among many to the protests now. Not only that, they said this is gonna hurt, this is gonna create a backlash, just like you're saying. This is gonna be a problem, this is gonna make it worse. And I don't think any reading of history can look at that and say that's accurate. And so the fact that a protest movement is not accepted by normie Americans, is, uncomfortable for them, rejected, where they think it's going to be a backlash, et cetera, is not at all determined if you look at history of how successful those movements are ultimately going to be. So, the apartheid movement in the 80s is like a great example of that. You had and it's probably a more close example to Israel than Vietnam, because you're right, there was much more focus on Vietnam. It was much longer period of time. You had Americans getting drafted, you had Americans dying. I mean, this was massive, right? The apartheid example, I think, is a much more closely related one. But you still had the same, like, normie backlash. You still had, I feel like, Fareed Zakaria out there, like, what are you kids doing? And
did he really say that?
Yeah, he was on the wrong side of that one. Funny. Yeah. Yeah, that got dug up recently in terms of context of it. Whatever. Anyway. And, but they mattered. They helped. Were they the only thing? No. But they were part of a global movement combined with internal struggle within South Africa itself that contributed to a climate that ended that racist regime. So I guess my question for you is, like, put yourself in the shoes of these college students. I don't know, you don't agree with their perspective. That's fine. But I think you are, I think you understand they're not doing this for, like, clout. They genuinely feel very passionate that there's a genocide that is being conducted in their name with their dollars, and they want to do whatever they can think of to do to throw some sand into these gears and to desperately try to stop these horrors that they see unfolding in front of their eyes. Like, what would you tell them to do?
It's a tough question. I mean, sometimes you have to understand too that you have no influence on the system. I mean, I felt this way whenever Congress passes Ukraine aid and we spend 2 years talking about how it's useless, how it's a stupid cause, how it's just gonna waste more life, and we get the majority of the American public on our side, and then Congress passes it anyway. What did I do the next day? I put on my suit and I came back to work. I mean, like, what else are you gonna do?
But
sometimes you gotta know when you're beat.
No significant protest movement with regard to Ukraine. And I think it is not correct to look at the response of Joe Biden and the Democrats and say they're not feeling the pressure. They very clearly are. I mean, I think, like, we know the U.S. was involved, and I believe this reporting was involved in trying to secure this ceasefire deal. Barack Ravid, who is, you know, the White House whisperer in all of this, is saying, like, they see this as really important politically, because Joe Biden obviously doesn't care about Palestinians. He's obviously a committed Zionist. He is feeling political pressure from this protest movement. That to me is very clear. And so since we don't really live in the kind of democracy where the majority like rules and just you get public sentiment on your side and that's it, that pressure that he feels from this movement is what counts way more than whether normies are upset about a campus building and a window broken and the, you know, what's the encampments. The disruption itself is creating the pressure that is the thing that could, I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but that could change things.
I don't disagree. I do think we're flirting right along the line right now of the same danger that happened back in the 1960s, where the disruption can turn and can actually be going against the disruption, can become a political asset. The reason I bring all these things up is not because I revel in the fact that America was frankly very sympathetic with the Jim Crow South, or at the very least didn't think it was their problem. It's only to say that I know that that was the reality. And so, like, you know, the sit-in thing is the perfect example. Like, this person calls it the most effective protest. It's just not true. 1961 was a time when the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy, his Attorney General, support rhetorically the civil rights protesters. At the day that Kennedy died, the likelihood of a Civil Rights Act being passed, 0%. It was his death and LBJ that eventually, the genius of LBJ ushers in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But then even to say that, you know, that these people were wrong, I don't think they were wrong. The truth is that race politics then rules the Republican Party in the South for what? 1968 race riots are basically the reason that Nixon gets elected. Then Ronald Reagan, everybody seems to just forget this, happens to launch his 1980 campaign in Mississippi at the very heart of like some serious segregationist sympathies. I mean, the year I was born in 1992, in Texas, 50% of the public did not support interracial marriage.
Amazing.
Which is nuts.
But
that actually happened the year that I was born.
But the question then, the logical question out of that then is, okay, so was it worth it? And I think most people would say, myself included, of course, getting the Civil Rights Act passed and ending segregation, ending Jim Crow, even knowing that it did create this, you know, the LBJ, we lost the South for a generation, him being right, like he knew that that was going to happen. It was still worth it. And so you're like, if your argument to me is like, oh, now Democrats are going to lose elections, you think I fucking care about that?
That's a fair
I don't care about that.
No, that's a fair point.
Like, if I knew that Democrats were going to lose elections for the next 20 years straight, but the genocide in Gaza was going to end, sign me up for that deal today. And I think that's the way that many of these they're not worried about how Democrats are going to do in the fall. The fact that they're a threat to Democratic electoral chances is the only thing that gives them power, because the Democrats certainly don't care about human life in Gaza. So yeah, it's a problem for Democrats electorally. Their policy in Gaza is a problem for them electorally. The way they're treating young people is a problem for them electorally. The chaos that they themselves created is a problem for them electorally. And to that I say, good. It should be. It should be a problem for you.
I agree, and I'm glad. I mean, you're honest about it, but they're not, right? I mean, these people are craven self-interest politicians. Like, I'm saying you and the protesters are like, yeah, we don't care about the Democrats. I'm with you, by the way. I'm with you. What I'm saying for them is these politicians, they're craven. They don't care. They're, narcissistic. All they want to do is really get reelected.
Right.
At the end of the day,
which is why causing problems for their reelection is the only strategy.
But what
because
if they
it's not like
that, saying screw you is more electorally beneficial, which I think there's a decent polling that there is.
We've been in a ceasefire has been a majority position since like day 2 of this war.
Definitely.
Public opinion has been on the side of these protesters, not maybe in terms of the protest tactics, but in terms of what they're actually protesting for a long time now, and it hasn't mattered. So if this is your number one issue, if you cannot sleep at night, seeing these children starving to death, children being bombed, knowing these are our tax dollars, like what else are you gonna do? This is the only, and they have been so disciplined, 99% nonviolent. Like the worst thing they've done is break a window and enter one campus building. Okay, that is incredible discipline. Very big contrast,
definitely,
with the 70s protests and with the Black Lives Matter protests as well. Like this is not guaranteed to work, but at least it has a chance of working. And I think that's all you can bet on, is that like I'm doing everything I can think to do. I'm being principled in my nonviolent tactics, which they really have been. And even now, even with I've never seen a media propaganda campaign like what we're seeing with this. I genuinely, this is beyond war on terror, whole of politics, congressional response, banning TikTok, Dana Bash and, Fox News making common cause with Bibi Netanyahu over these kids are Nazis and Joe Biden agreed, the whole bit, everybody in league. And you still have a clear plurality of Democrats who are like, nah, I'm with the protesters. I mean, that is pretty extraordinary. Like the Democratic base is quite split with specifically regards to the protest tactics, in spite of the most insane propaganda campaign I've ever seen. And the American public is very clearly on the side of the protesters in terms of wanting to secure a ceasefire and the end, and not supporting further aid to Israel and saying the Israeli military has gone too far. Like they're on their side in that. So yeah, I think this is the only thing that has even a chance of making a difference. And so I say God bless these protesters. Thank God for them.
We'll find out. We'll find out whether there's a cost or not.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.